So, we'll leave it at that for now. What I'd like to do today is pick up with a little discussion of Augustin. Augustin is another synthesizer and of course this should be getting fairly familiar to you. We have this sort of oscillation, right, in philosophical history between rationalism and empiricism. And the last great synthesis we talked about was Christianity, which may be the most brilliant and elegant synthesis of all, synthesizing those two traditions. And I didn't ask you the question on the test, although I told you I would, because I wanted you all to be sure to study it and have it in your heads. But I didn't actually pose the question to you, in what way is the Christian message a synthesis of those traditions? But I know you could all...
Test has an advantage.
Oh, really? You haven't taken the test?
And,
Oh, okay.
Jordan.
Well, all I'm telling you is what's not on the test now, so I won't say anything about what is on the test, all right?
5% bonus.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We'll see. So anyway, what you have after the advent of the Christian faith, which we'll put in the first century, of course. Oops, that's not good. You have the Christian synthesis. Undivided attention up here. Seniors, scholars, mature, adult. We have the Christian synthesis. And that really lands more or less like a bombshell in the middle of the Greco-Roman world. Probably the most robust philosophy floating around at the time was Stoicism. There were some pretty good Stoic philosophers out there. Seneca would be one of the better known ones. Epictetus in the first part of the 2nd century. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman Caesar, and various others are well-known Stoics. And that was probably the best alternative to the Christian faith. But it was not giving a big answer to the big questions. As you know, it was a philosophy of skepticism, practical, humanistic. The Christian faith comes along purporting to answer the big questions. Now, we as Christians believe it did answer the big questions, but right now I'm not talking as a Christian. I'm just talking as a historian. The Christian faith came on the scene claiming to answer the big questions. And it was the first time that anybody tried to do that for a while. And it got a lot of traction. Of course, it appealed originally to the slave class for the most part, but eventually worked its way into the higher echelons of the Roman culture, and began by the beginning of the 2nd century, mid-2nd century, to be affecting a whole lot of the Greek outlook, and it was creating some tension. And that's the point I want to pursue with you here. Yes?
Just briefly, why did it start in the slave class?
It just, the Christian faith, you see, it wasn't exclusively that, but by far the bulk of the earliest converts came from the lower classes of the Roman world. And, I have theories, and you might have theories about why that is the case. I think, Paul may say it the best. He says, God hasn't chosen the elite of this world, the wise, the noble, the great, philosophers, this and that. He's chosen the common people. And it does seem that the Christian faith had a kind of intuitive appeal to common folks. And why was that? If you're a Calvinist, you'll say it's because God chose to open their eyes and He closed the eyes of others. Jesus says you've chosen the babes of this world, not babes in the sense of infants, not good-looking women. You know what I'm saying. I think I quoted that very verse the year that Natasha was taking philosophy. I said something like, God has chosen the babes of this world. And Natasha just burst into laughter. Like, Miss Sister Gore, you have to learn to talk. You know, I learned a lot of stuff from her. You know, I owe her a lot, really. So, but anyway, I don't know, that's not an adequate answer, Avery, but it's a complicated question, more than you might even guess, as to why it was. But there was a... Jesus makes the appeal himself. Come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. That's not an appeal you make to the Caesar. That's to the poor, oppressed, lower classes. They're the ones that hear that message and tend to respond to it. You know, that'd be my best shot at it. But anyway, by the time you get to a little later, certainly you have higher levels of Roman society are affected by it, and it begins to put some pressure on paganism. Because remember, paganism is a money-making operation. You know, people make money off of pagan religion to this day. If you follow the money in neo-paganism and New Age religion and so on, you'll find out that whatever else it is a money-making enterprise. There's like this gal out of Yelm, Washington. Who's heard of Yelm, Washington? Yelm. Her name is J.Z. Knight. Ever heard of her? Anybody ever heard of J.Z. Knight? It's Jacqueline something or other. Anyway, she's this New Age prophetess. She claims that she was sitting in her kitchen one day playing with pyramids. And a guy shows up in the hallway leading into her kitchen, whose name is Ramtha, who happens to be a warrior from the lost continent of Atlantis. And that he came in and told her the great message that people in the 20th century need to hear. And she now claims to be a channeler for Ramtha. And I kid you not, people will pay $1,000 a pop to go in and hear her pass herself off as if she's channeling for Ramtha. This is nonsense. I mean, this is beyond dumb. You know, that people with that much money would waste it that way. And you know, if you watch her, you can go on YouTube if you want to get some entertainment. I suggest you go J.Z. Knight, and there's probably 50 clips of her pretending to be channeling for Ramtha, and she's doing it in front of big audiences of people that paid a lot of money to hear her pass herself off as some kind of priestess. All I'm saying is, paganism produces money for people that know how to manipulate it. And she sure does, and a lot of other people do. And that's what happened to the Christian faith, because the Christian faith doesn't sell itself. It doesn't say, hey, you pay $50, I'll tell you the secret gospel. Jesus died for your sins. That's not the way it works. We Christians keep saying, no, this is free of charge. You just go out and preach the gospel. There it is. You don't have to pay. It's a free gift, But if you're a Gnostic, if you're a pagan, oh no, it's not a free gift. There's a price tag on that wisdom. You have to pay for it, and sometimes pay a lot for it. And that was what was happening in the ancient world. The Christian faith was beginning to sabotage the money machine of ancient paganism, and people were getting upset. And so you begin to see a reaction to Christianity, and this creates the next sort of antithesis we've talked about. We've talked about Plato, Aristotle, and all of that. Well, this is the next one. And the guy that more or less creates a reaction, a conscious reaction to the Christian faith, a neo-pagan response was, we've looked at him already, Plotinus. And he's very good. And by the way, he gets very rich in the process, by the by. But he works out a highly sophisticated, quasi-religious philosophy that has come to be called Neoplatonism. We've talked about all this. And it got a lot of traction. People began to attach themselves, and it sort of stood off over against the Christian faith and put people in a kind of either-or. Either you take the Christian faith or you take Neoplatonism. And the problem is, it seemed that Plotinus and Neoplatonism had some pretty potent arguments. This guy was no dummy. I gave you kind of the quickest little snippet of Neoplatonism, but he's quite a sophisticated writer. He had quite a bit of influence, and people began to see him almost like another Plato, another great, thinker. And so what happens is then by about the middle of this 3rd century, we're in about the year 250, and thereafter you have once again this sort of impasse. Only now it's between Christianity and Neoplatonism. And it hangs out there for some period of time. The guy who comes along, who would be viewed generally as the great synthesizer, the guy who takes the Christian faith as it came down through biblical sources and valuable contributions from Plotinus, because not everything he says is bad. The guy who takes a chunk of the Christian faith and a chunk of Plotinus and mixes them and produces now a sort of a new iteration of the Christian faith, which was viewed as Augustinian Christianity, is of course Augustine. So I want you to understand that whatever else he was a guy who depended on Neoplatonism. He used it. Remember, Ambrose said, hey, go read Plotinus. And Augustine did. And he said, whoa, that does kind of explain some things that have been problematic. So here's a pagan writer who actually helps Augustine straighten out his own thinking. Many people are very critical of Augustine for this. And depending on what circles you move in your ongoing, academic career, you will run into people who think Augustine is wonderful and some people who are quite critical of him. And I've heard people accuse Augustine of being nothing more than a warmed-over Neoplatonist. I've heard that accusation, that he's overrated because all he did really was just incorporate this kind of pagan outlook and make it part of his theology. Well, I think that's a little overstated. I like Augustine, and I'm not going to fault him so much for doing this. Even pagans can say 2 + 2 = 4 and be correct, Just because you're not a Christian doesn't mean you can't figure out the Pythagorean theorem. There are certain things paganism can do, even philosophically, that will get at the right answer, even if you don't quite know how you got there, why you got there, or what you're going to do with it. You can still kind of have that right answer as a pagan. And personally, I think Christians are really well advised to find that common ground with the pagan. Where have you gotten the right answers in your thinking? Let's start there. My own opinion is that even though every pagan can get a right answer, they can never finish the problem. They always run into a dead-end street. That's where you can help them, But to just say, oh, you're a pagan, therefore everything you say is false. Get away from me. I think that's a little bit precipitous and probably incorrect. Well, that's what Augustine's trying to do. He's trying to hear anything Plotinus said that actually is serviceable to the Christian faith. Augustine, therefore, is tied not only to Plotinus, but more importantly, he's tied to Plato. And usually what you'll hear is not so much that Augustine was a synthesizer of Christianity and Plotinus. What you'll hear is that Augustine was a synthesizer of Christianity and Platonism. And that's probably a better way to put it. But Plotinus happened to be the guy on the block at the time who was the most conspicuous Platonist in town. And so, as a practical matter, he was the one. Who's the great thinker in church history? If we have a synthesizer between Christianity and Plato, who's the guy that comes along and becomes a synthesizer between Christianity and Aristotle? That would be, of course, who? Jake?
Aquinas.
Certainly Aquinas. You kind of follow that, so you have the oscillation going on. And we just want to kind of appreciate, how it's playing out. All right, so just briefly in the few, I don't want to dive into too much detail in this yet. We'll do that tomorrow. But I heard one guy present Augustine or introduce Augustine this way. I thought it was kind of neat, so I'm going to give it to you just for fun. You might want to hang on to it. He said, the life of Augustine can be understood in terms of 3 women, 3 philosophies, and 3 heresies. There you are. 3 women. Who are the 3 women do you suppose this guy was referring to? That would be the women who would have been most important in Augustine's life. Who do you think?
Maybe Monica?
Monica's got to be one of them, doesn't she? She's
the woman who he was with for a long time.
That's his girlfriend. She was important. And then there's one more woman.
I'm just guessing on someone. Could it be Mary?
No, it was a contemporary of his. He never met this woman. J.C. Knight. Well, the woman that the guy had in mind was the little girl who was singing Telelega, Telelega, you know, right? We didn't know for sure it was a girl, but it fits the little paradigm nicely, so we're gonna go with a little girl here. So the 3 women, this is the least important part of the discussion, but the other 2 are a little more important. The 3 philosophies that he said were the most important in the career of Augustine would be, first of all, Platonism, for the very reasons I've just tried to suggest to you. Manichaeism is going to come later. Good thought.
Are you meaning Neoplatonism when you're saying Platonism?
No, because I'm going to put that down separately. So the second philosophy is Neoplatonism. Not quite the same as Platonism, but they're very closely related. Sydney?
So when he synthesized, did he synthesize Platonism or Neoplatonism?
Really both. Really both. Remember, Neoplatonism is Platonic in a sort of broad sense of its cosmology, but you don't find in Plato things like the one, the nous, the psyche, the phusis. You don't find that stuff. That really comes much later. Plato is the ideal world, the ideal of the being, chairness, and all that stuff. So you can make a distinction, not a radical separation, but a distinction between Platonism and Neoplatonism. The third philosophy that this figure mentioned, this guy, this lecturer, was skepticism. This was, by the way, more connected to the Manichees, but it wasn't the Manichean religion. He just meant a kind of skeptical attitude. People entertaining more or less the notion that nobody can know for sure. This would be more the Stoic or even Epicurean perspective. You just can't know for sure. Nobody knows. That's the spirit of your age, by the way. That's the spirit of postmodernism. Nobody knows. Who knows? And so really, it makes you wonder, why bother getting educated if nobody knows? I kind of wondered about that. You ever thought about that? Depending on where you go to college, you'll run into some professors who will virtually say that to you. But they don't want you to drop out because their paycheck depends on you being there. So they have to walk kind of a tightrope. They want to say on the one hand, nobody knows the big answers. Nobody knows the answer to these questions. But this is what you got to know to pass the test, So they want to keep you kind of in that limbo. All right, the 3 heresies. Manichaeism is one of them. You want to guess that? Anybody have an idea what the other 2 would be? You've studied this at other times. Indeed, even under my tutelage, you have studied these at other times. So what would be the other heresies that pop up? Mr. Ansett.
One of them's Gnosticism.
No, it is not Gnosticism. I'm sorry. Excellent guess, but not quite. Gnosticism is almost passing from the scene by now, except as we see it in Neoplatonism. Yeah.
Arianism?
No, Arianism is still out there, but not as conspicuous. Remember, by the time Augustine dies in 430. Nicaea was in 325, so we're already 100 years out, from... Arianism was still around. In Spain, you'll find it. No, there's two others. One we looked at in some detail. Last year, in Doctrine, we looked at it, and it was called the blank controversy. Oh, you're letting me down? I just feel my knees going weak with waves of disappointment rolling over me because you can't recall. The great controversy in which Augustin was embroiled. Okay, I'll give you a huge hint. It had to do with original sin. It had to do with the extent to which original sin has infected us and made us dependent upon grace for our salvation. And the name of that controversy and the name of the great heretic with whom Augustine was engaged in this battle was, good heavens! I'm a failure. I'm out of here. Pelagianism.
Pelagianism controversy?
Yeah, the Pelagian controversy. We did do that, didn't we? Tell me we didn't cover it. Tell me I just forgot. Then I'll feel a lot better. All right, that's one of them. The other one is the Donatist controversy. I'm not sure we did talk about that one. I doubt that we did. So those are the three. Manichaeism, the Donatist controversy, and the Pelagian controversy. Those are the three heresies. All right. When we get back together tomorrow, I'm going to talk about his epistemology. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to just do some little bullets. Bullets of Augustine's theology. We won't deal with his theology that much, but this is just a chance to kind of hit the major talking points. Go check out JZ Knight, by the way. I find it quite entertaining. Augustine is usually viewed as the wellspring behind Luther's notion of justification by faith alone. However, let me immediately attach to that statement the caveat that Augustine never uses that expression the way that Luther does. Luther says we're justified by faith alone, and he's very strong on that point, and that's kind of the battle cry of the Reformation. And Augustine is not quite as precise. And a good Catholic will challenge you immediately if you say, well, Augustine taught justification by faith alone. They'll say, well, find it. And you'll have to look long and hard because it isn't quite there. I think the reason is because it was not the focus of the controversy at the time. And so Augustine himself wasn't speaking with the razor-sharp kind of clarity that one does when you're in the midst of a debate. There was a debate going on, but it wasn't over the place of faith. Faith was not the issue. And so Augustine doesn't have quite the precision here in his writing. And so really the Catholic's got a position to work from. But I think it's safe to say that Luther, Calvin, the whole Reformed tradition believe that if you really, pulled Augustine in and forced the issue, he would definitely come out at this point because the rest of his theology virtually demands it. And so I'm going to put this up here, even though I want you to realize it's a little bit of a dicey one. What he really does emphasize and what is at the heart of his theology is grace. He is called in Catholic tradition the Doctor of Grace. Just as Thomas Aquinas is called the Doctor, everybody know? He's given this special title, the Doctor of the Angels. The Catholics like to do that, kind of give you these big deal titles. So anyway, because, of course, grace is shot through all of his writing. He is deeply devoted to the idea of our helplessness in salvation. And so one thing you have to recognize when you read Augustine, it's shot through his writing, is a robust notion of predestination. He is a predestinarian and probably the first thoroughgoing predestinarian in church history. It was out there, you see it implied in other places, but it was never really the subject of a great controversy till the Pelagian controversy. That was really what was at stake. It was how do we understand our dependence on grace for salvation. Is it 100% grace? If so, then that translates into a predestinarian theology. Or is there something you do, even if it's the most modest contribution of belief or virtue or faith or choice or something, then to that degree you see it's grace plus something. That's the way the debate worked out at the time of Augustine. And that, by the way, is of course something the Reformers picked up and was very much a part of their thought as well. It's this point that the Reformers really liked. This is where the Reformation really got its inspiration from Augustine. The other great theme in his theology was the church. And that's what the Catholics get excited about. We'll talk about this later, hopefully, if we have time. Augustine gives a classic formulation of the church. We'll look at this, hopefully, and we'll see how our time goes at some point. Does anybody know it's a fourfold definition of the church? The church is blank, 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 and blank. And you've all heard it. Ben?
It's one holy, Catholic, and apostolic.
Exactly. And the other point in Augustine's theology that I just want to highlight here is his eschatology. He is what's come to be called amillennial. He didn't use that term, but just abbreviate that. Amil. Anybody know that expression? What does it mean to say you're amil or amillennial? That new? Ben? What is it?
Doesn't that just mean you don't believe in the millennium?
I don't think Augustine would leave it exactly there. It means you don't believe in the millennium in a certain sense of the millennium. In what sense of the millennium do you not believe in the millennium? Avery?
Is it the 1,000 years reign?
Yeah, and what does that look like? What does the 1,000 years reign look like? Avery, go ahead.
Just Christ coming back and reign on earth for 1,000 years.
Exactly, yeah. Who was really advocating that so-called premillennial eschatology at the time? Where was that, really being advocated? Yeah.
I think that was in Antioch.
Well, Antioch for sure, yes. We talked about that earlier. Joe, you were going to say?
The Ebionites.
The Ebionites, exactly. And more broadly, the whole Jewish world. And certainly the Jewish Christian world still clung rather vigorously to a premillennial eschatology. Jesus is coming back soon, and he's going to fix this world and set up a kingdom and rule for 1,000 years, and the world's going to be like a paradise, Now, the location of the throne, the reign of Jesus, varied. Jewish people tended to say it'd be in Jerusalem, which at that time was still not much of a city, had been destroyed. Many were saying, well, no, it'll be in Rome. That Jesus is going to turn out to be the true, ultimate, big deal Roman emperor, and he'll rule over the world from Rome for 1,000 years. And other people said other things. But anyway, that was out there. And it was losing steam even by the time of Augustine. You don't hear about it so much. But Augustine really nailed the coffin shut on premillennialism. You really just don't hear about it at all after Augustine until well after the Reformation. There's about 1,000 years where you just don't even hear about it. And what Augustine put in place instead is commonly called amillennialism, meaning there is no millennium in that premillennial sense. That the so-called millennium is actually referring to the time of the church. And in that sense, we are in the millennium. And both of those views have been out there. Of course, premillennialism is probably the dominant view in evangelical Christianity in America today, as I assume most of you know. But it wasn't that way for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years you didn't even hear about it. John Calvin, when commenting on premillennialism, it's a famous quote. He's touching on eschatological views, and he mentions premillennialism, and he says, his quote goes something like this: "It's a Jewish fancy so puerile it does not even deserve refutation, period." And he goes right on. So that was how dismissive Calvin was of premillennialism. Obviously today, I think Calvin would say more about it because it's a dominant eschatological outlook, especially in conservative circles these days. But Augustine's really contribution was more the amillennial. Okay, fair enough. Arrivederci.